If you navigate to the ships section of the store and then go over to the ships for rental tab, you'll find the Tier 7 Russian battleship Borodino, which is currently in testing. And this is a bit of a peculiar ship. Now, it hasn't been fully released into the game, and when and if it does make its debut in World of Warships Legends as a campaign reward or a premium that you can buy from the store, some things about this ship may have changed. But for now, I want to go over the stats, the armor, commander build, etc., talk about how the ship plays, because I think this is a pretty interesting vessel. So, as usual, we'll run down the stats and keep in mind that everything I tell you here is going to be influenced by my commander build. As usual, when it comes to the Russian battleships, I'm using Mikhail Kedrov rather than Galler, because Kedrov simply is the best choice, in my opinion, for pretty much every Russian battleship out there, and I don't think the Borodino is any exception. Here's the build here on the screen. It's going to take a while for us to really get moving into this battle, so we'll begin by starting with the HP. The Borodino's HP pool is not all that impressive. It's sort of right in line with Tier 7, but it's 64,200. And it's got 30% torpedo damage reduction, which overall isn't that impressive. And if we take a look at the armor scheme as we get into position here, we'll notice something interesting. Both the bow and stern plating, at least the upper portions of it on the Borodino, are 25 millimeters, meaning they can be overmatched by pretty much every battleship you're going to encounter. Now, it does have a 50 millimeter icebreaker plating on the bow, and the side armor, at least the upper side armor, is 50 millimeters, and so is the deck. So that's some pretty robust armor protection, at least as far as the side plating goes. And that icebreaker on the bow might prevent you from getting citadeled sometimes, but the citadel is quite exposed and very accessible. You do have to be careful. You certainly don't want to be giving broadside in this thing. It's got sort of a battle cruiser armor scheme rather than a full battleship one. Now for the guns. You might have noticed that the guns are in two triple turrets for 6 guns in total, and both of them are set on the bow, much like the Lenin or Jean Bar, things like that. But this ship is not quite like those ships because of the bow armor. It can be overmatched at least through the top portion, and therefore I don't know that it's going to be the best bow tanker you've ever seen. Keep in mind also that Kedrov really doesn't do anything to the guns except buff the turret traverse. So the stats for the guns are as follows. They are 16-inch or 406 millimeter guns. Of course, there are 6 of them. They have a maximum firing range of 17.6 kilometers. They do reload pretty quickly, 25.2 seconds, which I think is a balancing factor for the fact that there are only 6 of them. The turret traverse time is excellent, at least with Kedrov at the helm. It's 24.8 seconds. And you might have noticed that in the beginning of this game, I fired a little bit of high explosive. There's 2 reasons for that. Number 1, the high explosive characteristics on this ship are pretty good. The shells hit for a maximum of 5,800 damage with the HE, and they have a very nice 40% fire starting chance, which I think is good, especially if you couple it with the shorter reload, at least shorter relative to most battleships. The AP, for its part, does a maximum of 13,500 damage, and the thing has secondaries that I don't think are worth speccing into, despite the fact that you'll notice that one of the consumables is the secondary reload consumable, or the secondary enhancement consumable, whatever it's called. That might lead you to believe, because there's no other choice to replace that consumable with, that this could be a secondary battleship, but I don't think so. The secondaries are 180 millimeters, which is a little bit bigger than you would expect, but the base range is 5.2 kilometers, so if you spec into them, you're really not going to get too much range out of them. The AA defense rating is probably not worth mentioning as usual because, I mean, how often do we even really see CVs? There's not one in this game. I don't think the AA is too great, though. It's only got an overall aggregate rating of 71 for whatever that is worth. But the mid range AA only has a range of 4 km and it does an average DPS of 212 per second, which I don't think sounds all that impressive. Maneuverability on this thing, likewise, not all that impressive, at least in one aspect. The top speed is fine. It's 31 knots, which means it's probably a little bit faster than the typical battleship at the tier. Of course, I'm not running gyrating drill bits, but I assume those of you who are Lev Galler fans for the Russian battleships might, and in that case, your speed is going to be lower. The turning circle is terrible. It's 1,060 meters. Although when I was playing the ship, I didn't really think it had that bad of a time turning, and that might be due to the rudder shift, which is 15.4 seconds. And for a battleship, I'd say that's pretty good. Of course, for concealment, we are using Kondo as one of the inspirations, and we've got the concealment module. So we've got a 12.6 kilometer detectability by sea, which I think is pretty good. I think it would also be remiss of me not to mention the rest of the consumables. We already know about the secondary enhancement, but there is something a little bit unusual here. Most of the Russian battleships have the fast-acting damage control party consumable, which means the consumable reloads very quickly, but you only get a limited amount of them. The Borodino has conventional damage control. The charges are unlimited, and the reload time is 72 seconds, so just over a minute, much more like a standard battleship damage control party. So there's that. And then the heal, interestingly enough, is improved. It's not a super heal like the Nelson, for example. The Nelson's repair party does an HP restoration of about 1,200 per second. Borodino's does 776 HP per second, and it has a 20-second duration, reloads in 73 seconds. So it's an improved heal. It can restore, maybe 3-4 bars of health compared to regular battleships heals, which do maybe 2 at best. And then it has radar, which is something else you might have noticed. I don't know that... No, actually, I think we will use the radar at some point in this match. It's a little bit like Soviet cruiser radar, except better. It's got a detectability range for ships of 11.7 kilometers, much like the Chapayev, for example. But unlike the Chapayev, this radar doesn't last for 15 or 20 seconds, or whatever the duration is. The Russian cruisers have long range on their radar, but they have a short duration to make up for that. This thing gets both long range and long duration. It lasts for 30 seconds rather than 15 or 20. So maybe, just maybe, you're able to get off 2 salvos from these main guns if they reload in 25. You pop the radar, fire off the salvo, then you should have about 5 seconds left to get a second one by the time things are done. And now we should probably talk about the guns after we just saw that Citadel against the Missouri. It seems to me that the Borodino shares the same characteristic as the rest of the Russian battleships when it comes to dispersion. If you don't know, these Russian battleships have some sort of unique dispersion formula, where at range their dispersion is worse, but the closer you get, say within inside 13 or 12 kilometers or so, the tighter the dispersion becomes and the more accurate the guns become. I think that is true for this ship. You saw, I think, a little earlier that the salvos we were sending against the more distant ships out there were not the most accurate things in the world. But as we get closer, the dispersion tightens up, and these guns absolutely wreck things. The HE, likewise, is pretty good, as this Jervis is going to find out. In fact, as I've been playing this ship, I've been using the HE a little bit more at distance, just because the fire chance is really good, and the dispersion is not ideal. So when these shells land and start fires, well, it can be quite helpful. And then once you push in and the guns become a little bit more accurate, switch to the AP and you can absolutely wreck things. This game is coming to a close, though, and this, I think, is the most interesting sequence in it because we've got a Sinop and a Georgia right in front of us. And of course, we looked at the armor scheme of this ship earlier, and we found that it has an overmatchable bow, at least the top part of it, but very robust side plating. And of course, the turrets are very heavily armored, and the superstructure is not much to speak of. So let's take a look at how this Georgia fares as we push in here. Sinop, for whatever reason, has given up and decided to donate his HP to us, so thank you very much, Mr. Sinop. We get the high caliber medal because of that, and the Sinop won't be floating for too much longer. I think in retrospect, by the way, I probably should have brought the guns over to the port side of the ship, aimed them at this Plymouth, and tried a little bit harder to sink this guy, and then rammed the Georgia, which is not what I end up doing, but it is what I think the correct play here is. Plymouth, of course, smokes up, though, so Georgia is really the only thing we can shoot at, and he's slightly angled to us, so our AP is not necessarily going to be the most effective thing in the world, but with the unique Russian dispersion, we should be able to dial it into his superstructure and deal at least a little bit of chunk damage, although right there, when I caught sight of the Plymouth, I really think I should have turned my guns his way, because while we do a respectable amount of damage into the Georgia's superstructure with over-penetrations and such, the damage would have been better against the Plymouth. We probably could have deleted that thing and then rammed the Georgia to finish out this game. But we're not going to do that. You'll notice, though, that the Georgia hasn't been doing great damage to us. The Borodino, I don't think, is a very well-known ship, so Georgia probably doesn't know that he can overmatch the top bow plating of this ship. You can see he bounces his shells there against the icebreaker, and he's been aiming into the superstructure, which he can't really pen because of the turrets and their armor. Of course, he can penetrate the side for a citadel, and he ultimately ends up taking us out. So it just goes to show you that if you give broadside in this thing, you will get wrecked, especially if you're getting shot at by something like the Georgia. Although I think the work we did in this game is going to be enough. The Georgia doesn't have too much health left. He's also not got the tankiest armor in the world, so these cruisers are going to be able to farm him down quite easily. And we've got one full health cruiser and another sort of less than full health, half health cruiser versus a Plymouth. So they should be able to take him out and win this game. I think we did enough for our team in terms of battle impact here. In any case, Borodino is an interesting vessel, to be sure. I think it's one that not everybody is going to be a huge fan of due to the armor scheme. Everybody seems to be obsessed with bow armor plating, even though I think it doesn't really matter too much when you've got that icebreaker and you've got the robust side plating. But still, this is sort of like a battle cruiser, I would say, more than a battleship. It's almost like the Russian version of the sort of Dunkirk type vessels. And as such, I think it's pretty good. It's pretty fast. It's not the most maneuverable thing in the world, but the guns are good, and the radar, which I think this makes it, the third battleship with radar in World of Warships Legends, following the Missouri and the Constellation. Now we've got the Borodino. And the radar is different from both the Missouri and the Constellation. Those both have American radar with a range of 9 or 10 kilometers. This is 11.7 kilometer, 30-second duration radar. So I think it makes it an interesting battleship that is probably going to be best played by flanking the enemy, using the 16-inch guns to deal damage to broadsides at close to medium range after you've achieved a flank, perhaps using HE to burn down other battleships at range, and then potentially using that radar in place of a cruiser to detect things like destroyers and take them out. I think this ship has a high potential for battle impact, and as it stands in its testing iteration, it seems pretty good to me. It has definite strengths, it has definite weaknesses, especially with that armor plating, And although people see all the turrets on the bow as a benefit, it can be a liability, particularly if you push in too far and have to disengage by kiting. You're not really going to be able to do it very well in this ship. And the secondaries aren't much to speak of either. But it's an interesting ship. I think it's worth renting if you don't mind throwing away 1,000 doubloons to play it for 7 days. And when it comes into the game as a fully fledged vessel, whether they put it in as a campaign reward or do something else with it, I'll be interested to see if there's any changes to it. Hope you enjoyed this video. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.